Good evening and welcome to Ashkal Alwan. We're very happy to have Akram Zaatari with us in a talk that is that's following the publication of Akram's most recent book, Against Photography: An Annotated History of the Arab Image Foundation. Akram Zaatari co-founded the Arab Image Foundation in 1997 as a means to contain a drive for collecting, and it was, but also to give that drive an institutional framework. And there was exactly that intersection between two types of, or two modes of archival practices, the artistic practice and the institutional practice, that gives the Arab Image Foundation and continues to give it kind of a critical edge and originality. The photographic object has been at the heart of Akram Zaatari's practice for many, many years. I think that can, without further introduction, I think most of you here are familiar with Akram's work, so I will not take much more of your time. So please welcome Akram Zaatari.
Shukran, Muhammad. Thank you all. Thank you, Christine, Ashkal, Alwan, for not this invitation, for allowing me to present this almost at home with a beautiful audience, with many faces I know from so many years, and it's great. Nahla Haydous was killed in April 1996 in an incident referred to in Lebanon as the Qana massacre, when the Israeli Air Force bombed a UNIFIL compound sheltering civilians. More than 100 men, women, children burned to death within minutes, so that it was virtually impossible to distinguish their individual remains. Very quickly after the ceasefire that followed the attack, political and religious authorities met and agreed with UNIFIL to bury all the victims in a single mass grave at the location of the bombing. Irrespective of their gender or religion, all the 106 victims were buried altogether. Immediately following their burial, the grave was covered with portraits of individual victims, printed in different sizes and sometimes cut out of pre-existing group photos, then mounted in collages and framed with what was available. Nahla's portrait was framed by her family and placed on the grave. They applied colorful plastic flowers around her face, literally glued onto the surface of the glass to cover her visible hair. Haydous did not wear the scarf like many people at a young age when her portrait was taken. But because she wore it when she was older, her family found it inappropriate for her to appear in public in this photo, head uncovered. A photograph like this is a perfect example of a production and an aesthetic that evolved out of urgency and were shaped by prevailing local customs. The framed portrait as an object is in harmony with its original social habitat. I tend to use the term habitat in my work since a few years ago, and I prefer it by far on the word context, because habitat involves so many set of relationships, codes. So, and actually, habitat is a whole ecosystem, and I think photographs exist in our world, not only in a context, but they exist in an ecosystem. Photographs inform us, but also affect us. They make us cry. We cannot be only their context. We are together in an ecosystem that changes, and we changed, and photographs changed as well. So when I use the term habitat, it's because of that. So again, back to the portrait. It might not be perfectly vernacular photography, but it is indeed a vernacular assemblage of elements that produce an object of portraiture that is photographic in its initial form, but rectified, amended, or transformed by its users to suit a specific occasion. So Nahla's portrait at home would not have looked like this, but because it's a portrait of her to be placed in public for a specific occasion, it had to be changed. The original portrait was intended to hang at home in the family's private space. It's not a portrait that Nahla or her family would have expected to see in public, but because representations of martyrs are expected to be formal, and because that was Nahla's only recent portrait available, it necessitated an intervention. Moreover, in this specific case, they are also an integral part of a larger site-specific photographic monument of a political nature. When I encountered Nahla's portrait in 1996, I was drawn to how local customs shaped the appearance and aesthetic of the portrait. It struck me how little I knew about South Lebanon, which is where I come from, and how little I knew about dressing up pictures for an occasion. Had I encountered this portrait without learning the story behind it, I would have thought flowers were some kind of influence of a Mexican tradition or simply a decorative crown. Nahla's portrait and the story behind it were collected by a Lebanese journalist, Doha Shams, in May 1996 while researching material for her Hadith al-Suwar. It's a Hadith al-Suwar project was published as a supplement of a Safir Daily on 26 June 1996. And this is an issue, this issue of the Safir supplement remains a rarity in the Lebanese press, an instance where a tragic event was commemorated not through photographs of the event itself, but through a secondary photographic production that evolved very quickly within days. The supplement presented or studied the vernacular and its ability to provide insight onto a poor and marginalized rural community which remains, the South, if not victim of an assault, almost absent from most people's consciousness in Lebanon. The friendship ties that tie me to Doha Shams and the photographic assistance I provided her with while she was researching these photographs, these photographic documents at time when discussions about the creation of the Arab Image Foundation were taking place, led one of the co-founders of the foundation, Samer Madad, to propose presenting this research to the Rencontre Photographique d'Arles in France. And this is how this body of work became officially the Arab Image Foundation's first exhibition in the summer of 1999, before the foundation had even an office, curated by Samer Madad and based on material and research by Doha Shams. My interest in this picture, 20 years after its original presentation, has to do with the path that it took from a mere description of a woman's face to a dressed up object on her grave, to a small image in a newspaper, to the duplication of its framed version for the Arab Image Foundation and its exhibition in an international photographic event, and finally its inclusion in the Arab Image Foundation's collection. This genealogy traces the object's displacement from one habitat to another, cutting through multiple practices and modes of work, notably portraiture, journalism, art, interinstitutional loans, and photograph preservation. The traces that multiple displacements from one habitat to another, the traces that displacements leave on a photographic object over time become part of it. This is why I'm saying photographs change. Not only they carry new inscriptions, but they change because of those inscriptions and because of the changes in the habitat and because of the way we changed while looking at them. So a photograph is not the same 20 years later. When I saw this photograph in 1996, it produced something. Today it produces something else. The gesture of taking this photographic item as a sample to converse with today, stems from my interest in non-photographic practices, and let's call them transactions, that might leave a trace on the physical matter of a photograph or negative, sometimes to the extent of transforming the image completely. This is a direction and an interest that developed in my work gradually towards the end of my research conducted on photography in the Middle East and the search for collections in the early years of the Arab Image Foundation. In the body of work entitled Against Photography, I tried to grasp, make sense of, traces of photographers' work, of archival institutional practices, traces of wear over time, erosion, or poor conservation. I try to understand those phenomena and write with them a parallel history of our times. The idea is to close eyes while looking at a picture. The idea is to open senses other than seeing in the presence of a photograph. Be picture blind in order to see beyond content. Resist reducing a photograph to a description and get hold of its totality, but with the same objects and using a similar logic. Why not write a parallel history of the Arab Image Foundation as well? And that one can call annotations to the Arab Image Foundation's history. The exhibition that you see now at Sversamler Gallery, and that's called Third Window, is in a way based on the other exhibition that is called Against Photography, an annotated history of the Arab Image Foundation. But because that exhibition is still touring, we only reproduced part of that exhibition and built upon it, added a few other works that had nothing to do with the history of the foundation. We called it something else. So muting interest in the portrait itself, while looking back at Nahla Haydou's picture, invites other information to emerge. Looking at the backside of any portrait reveals other types of information, normally. It carries traces of life, traces of displacement, descriptions, dedications, texts of all sorts, and all sorts of tags which might have tied the picture to an organizational practice while serving an individual, an institution, or both. Photographs carry, or sometimes are themselves, residues of transactions, like an ATM receipt printout. Any discipline, in my opinion, that is based on studying photographs only for their content fail to seize the totality of what a photograph is and the intangible fabric that ties it to its habitat. Looking away from the two-dimensional, back to the pictures, looking away from the two-dimensional reproduction of flowers, this is clearly a reproduction of a portrait that was enlarged, where a black and white portrait where color flowers were added. Placed on Nahla's, the flowers placed on Nahla's portrait in the form of a crown reveals other peripheral yet equally significant information. A thin shadow to the left indicates that the reproduction had been placed behind a mount. So there's a big difference between this and that. The second image shows us that there's a thickness that means something. Looking away from the mount reveals that the reproduction might have been framed. Moving the eye further out from Nahla's portrait reveals a typical industrial golden frame. When Duha Shams returned to the families of Qana, of the families of the Qana victims, with Arl's invitation to exhibit the photographs, she asked them to make duplicates of the framed photographs they had placed at the mass grave. This one, so what people sometimes confuse, the exhibition that happened in Arles in France in 1997 did not exhibit the original pictures, because the original pictures stayed on the grave in Qana, in South Lebanon. What Duha did, based on the request of Samer Madad, is go to the families and ask them another duplicate. That's an exact replica of what is on the grave. And this is how we were able to produce the exhibition for we as the Arab Image Foundation. This one specifically was trickier. Most of the other ones came like to be really identical to the ones at the grave, except this one, because the one on the graves carry original flowers. This one is a copy, so it's a flat reproduction of the object with flowers, of the portrait with flowers. This one was trickier to remake than the others, however, because it involved three-dimensional flowers. Consequently, the family asked the only photographer's shop in Qana to simply take a picture of the framed photograph with the flowers on it, crop the frame out, and put the picture in a new frame. The result is a two-dimensional reproduction of a framed picture, cropped and reframed to look as close as the original as possible. Now, the peripheries of the image show that the portrait is contained within a 4x5 inch Kodak reversal transparency, which itself is a record of an institutional practice. This is an essential practice when receiving exhibitions on loan, but also a necessity for a press kit in pre-digital times. In pre-digital times, if you're doing an exhibition, you make available to the press 3 pictures that you give on slides, either 35 millimeter if you don't have a lot of money, and if you have a lot of money, if you are a big institution, you produce something that looks like this, and you make 20 of those, and you give to each newspaper 1 of them. So if they want to reproduce the image, they use it. This framed image, this framed picture, among others, was reproduced upon the reception of the framed Qana portraits in Arles in 1997, and naturally the Arab Image Foundation was sent a set of all these transparencies, which we still keep. The reproduction was done clearly with one source of light, as can be seen from the single shadow and the frame the frame is slightly tilted. There is a bit too much magenta, and no color scale was used. Inside the frame of the transparency, over the blank space in the bottom right-hand corner, a number is inscribed by hand with blue permanent ink. This is the serial number that is given to the object by the Arab Image Foundation. And in this case, it's 0113 SH 00011. The Qana portraits remained atypical in the collection of the Arab Image Foundation. They were not researched using the methodology and the criteria that were put in place by the founders of the foundation and remained unprocessed for a long time. Furthermore, while Doha Shams insisted on collecting the victims' names, placing them carefully next to their portraits in the exhibition, she always felt that that precision was less of a priority for the curator, who was interested in the portraits themselves, in how to display them, in what kind of what they produced in space. No one at the Arab Image Foundation made the effort to take note of Nahla's name, nor the names of other victims. Nowhere in the AIF database or records were these names transcribed, and consequently, this text referred to the original newspaper from 1996. It was over a year until the collection was given a number. And so, although it was finally numbered 0113, which which means that 112 collections were processed prior to this one. Like the few collections that did not fit easily into obvious categories, because the foundation is really a very atypical organization. The only model that it had, existing model, is photo agencies. And photo agencies cared only to publish pictures and captions. So they have a way to write captions. They have a clear thesaurus of keywords. They publish an image and not an object of a photograph. Therefore, while trying to process a collection like this one, bulky framed photographs, it took time for the Arab Image Foundation to digest it into a system. So like the few collections that did not fit easily into obvious categories of prints and negatives, less typical items such as damaged and collated glass plates, objects, and larger fabrics of photographic material took more time to be processed, or even have not been processed until this day. Examples, the 5 wooden drawers. The 5 wooden drawers filled with 35mm rolls containing the work of photo surprise photographers from Tripoli, employed by Photojac Studio, or other albums also made by this studio to house negative sheets and portraits, or the dozens of collated glass plates rescued by Mohsin Yamin from Antrani Kanouchian's studio in Tripoli after it was flooded, or the work of Radwan Matar, which the IAF received in 35mm rolls, housed in sleeves in plastic folders, or the Saida-based photographer Muhammad al-Bayrumi, 35mm work, or the manuscripts of scholar Jibrail Jabbour, all remain perfect examples of such atypical material. We are also very lucky to have Tamara, who worked on these, Sawaya, Raya Badran, who worked also on this, Christopher and Sherbil, Saad, who are still part of the foundation and who clearly know what I'm talking about. Because there is no formula for an organization like an Arab Image Foundation. We have to daily ask ourselves questions, problematize every single step in order to know how to act, where to put the number or something like this that has already a few hundred numbers. This is like a simple question. How to maintain this organization also. These are individual films, each housed in a small box. How to keep it as is, what to preserve in it, are we allowed to change that organization or not? These are simple questions that sometimes make you put the object on hold because you don't have an answer. And this is what happened to Nahla, to the Qana collection. So photographic material around us does not only consist only of photographic prints as we popularly know them. The Arab Image Foundation receives prints framed with bulky wooden sections. It receives stereographs, both negative and positive. It receives transparencies, lantern slides, equipment such as viewers, cameras, and other storage devices like simple boxes of film and paper stock, old promotional material, photo index books, manuscripts, photo albums, and all sorts of negative types and formats. We are surrounded by so many negatives, the photographer's working plates. And for someone who is not familiar with photographic processes, negative sheets or plates would remain enigmatic, even though they dominated photographic processes in the late 19th century and most of the 20th century. The negative often carries traces of photographers' work, and without it, we would not be able to tell how a photographer produced an image. A negative is equivalent to an engraved zinc plate in traditional printmaking. Not only does it allow the reproduction of the image or print, but it itself carries traces of photographers' tricks, effects that might have corrected exposure mistakes and improved a picture. It may also carry additional elements from other pictures in the case of collages. Photographers do not want their negatives to be displayed because they carry details that they do not want to share or they may not want to share. Furthermore, photographic material at the Arab Image Foundation includes much more than the material it received from researchers on missions or what it received from donations or deposits. Organizational and preservation practices at the Arab Image Foundation produce so many versions of images in its collection, particularly in the late 90s, when digital reproduction was still not reliable. I'm saying physical, not digital versions, but also physical versions in the 90s. The Arab Image Foundation produced Contact prints, for example, internegatives intended to reproduce original photographs for their owners, therefore we needed to produce internegatives to print them, and very often exhibition prints or reprints. And let's call all of these transactions of factual records. Sorry, let's call all of these transactions factual records. Every time a record is produced, an organizational practice leaves a trace. Every time a record is reproduced, a producer has authored a new work. I would even go so far as to say that every time a record is reproduced, something in it or in the knowledge of it changes. In analog media, the quality of a second generation reproduction is considered inferior to the original. There's a term that we used to use a lot in the 90s, الأصلي بدي فيلم أصلي أما بدي كاسيت أوديو أصلي. أصلي means like an original one, not a copy of an original one. Just like occurred to me because 2 weeks ago Ziad Rahbani used it on his interview on TV, and I laughed like I have not heard the term أصلي since the 90s, because with digital there's no more أصلي خلاص. So in analog media, the quality of a second generation reproduction is considered inferior to the original, but from a historical perspective, every subsequent generation carries more information than the previous one. Haydou's portrait is a reproduction of a remake, a reproduction of a reproduction. Taking it as a sample item to study today is getting hold of the latest generation reproduction. And consequently, the portraits belonging to variously social, journalistic, curatorial, institutional, archival, and possibly artistic practices. If you take the first generation, it's a product of a photographic practice. But the last one is a product of all of those. Every photograph is taken in a location, and unless it's a picture of a dark room, is physically printed in another location. Yet, photographs end up elsewhere, in so many different places, in pockets, in drawers, in wallets, and they are meant to travel and live in the proximity of people. They are part of this ecosystem. Diffusion is one of the essences of photography. Photographs are given to friends, and they manage to get a life on their own, find the people who are interested in keeping them. But many inherit photographs of distant members of the family, of people they don't even know or recognize. Institutions also end up custodians of photographs and of photographs of unidentified people, as is the case with the Arab Image Foundation. Many photographs are left behind in rented apartments after an old member of the family dies. Many photographers' archives are thrown away after a photographic studio closes down. Photographs end up changing locations from one custodian to another, and their displacement all too frequently registers on the body of images, the body of film, the body of glass. It is a misconception that photographs testify to the course of history. It is history that inhabits photographs over the course of time at every dynamic shift that produces displacement, history finds its way to an image through the cracks and pores of sensitized emulsion. How many of you have seen the exhibition, The Third Window, at Sphere Zambler Gallery? Okay. Then we dive in it. In May 1948, the State of Israel was announced. And over the years that followed, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left or were forced to leave their homes and villages and were never allowed back. They left all their belongings behind, entire libraries, albums, photographs, clothes, carpets, silverware, musical instruments, and handcrafts among so many other things. Those who stayed saw lands, homes, orange groves changing ownership, sometimes sold, sometimes confiscated. Those who witnessed the Nakba speak of photographs and paper documents thrown away in the garbage or out on the street, their own. They saw homes, institutions, records, or shops being looted. They experienced their times being reinvented by others in a different language. They experienced a rewriting of their own history differently. To come to argue about history now, to challenge what has been rewritten, many look for photographs of Palestinians leaving home, crossing the bridge, settling in camps, etc. UNRWA photographs, there are plenty. Many look for photographs of Israeli aggression as evidence, as a historical record. But could this history be told by pointing at aggression towards random photographs as opposed to pointing at the content of photographs? History, at its best, finds its way to pictures through folds of the ordinary, even in the representations of the banal. Palestinian Armenian photographer Antranik Bakirjian photographed his own home destroyed after the bombing of the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem in May 1948. Beautiful picture that you're not going to see. One of the few pictures he took included a dozen of teenagers, boys and girls, singing and playing musical instruments while standing on the partially demolished stone staircase. Bakirjian himself identified this picture as, quote-unquote, neighbors singing over the destroyed home where I live. Following this bombing, Bakirjian and many of his neighbors from the Armenian from the Armenian district took refuge at the Armenian convent of St. James. From then onwards, Bakirjian would take pictures of the fortification of the convent compound and the daily lives of displaced people inside. To attach to these photographs a press label would be to ignore the displacement of their maker and his darkroom. Bakirjian worked from home and never had a studio. He photographed his friends and members of the Armenian community in Jerusalem, accompanied people on trips in Palestine and Jordan, and was called to take pictures of religious ceremonies in Jerusalem too. In 1998, Ito Barada, the artist and former member of the Arab Image Foundation, traveled to Ramallah and to Jerusalem looking for photographic collections for the recently created Arab Image Foundation. Bakirjian agreed to donate his negatives to the Arab Image Foundation. And I'm still amazed by the fact that Ito visited Jerusalem on only one day, and she met with Bakirjian only a few hours, and she left him with all his negatives. And from there and on, he would never see his negatives again. I don't know why, I cannot ask myself this question, but it looked like someone putting his kid on a ship, on a vessel that is leaving a place that he hates. From that day onwards, he would never see them again. Barada left Jerusalem for Paris with a collection of 35mm negatives. And in Paris, she delivered this material to Fouad al-Khouri, a co-founder of the Arab Image Foundation. Why? Because she cannot travel from Jerusalem directly to Beirut. And she lived in Paris, so she went back to Paris, delivered the material to Fouad al-Khouri, who was in charge to take them by hand to Beirut. Al-Khouri had his own dark room at home. Those who know Fouad knows that he's a photographer and he has his own dark room. He wasn't at ease with how the rolls smelled, what we call a vinegar syndrome. So he gave the negatives a proper wash and left them to dry. He's always done it for his own negative, and he's a professional. In Beirut, the negatives underwent a series of work processes. They were cleaned and numbered, and some of their content was used in Fouad al-Khouri's Jour Tranquille en Palestine, a video which he made with Sylvain Roumet in 1998 and was screened on Arte. A few years later, an AIF archivist, I don't know if it was Tamara or someone else, probably you, noticed that some of the roles had changed because all these roles had been contact printed immediately upon reception. And few years later, we realized that the negatives actually did not correspond to the contact print that was made a few years before. The emulsion on a dozen rolls developed cracks and slightly moved off their bases, causing the distortion of the images on them. Other parts of the images disappeared completely, although the emulsion had not cracked. Patches of transparency invaded some rolls, erasing certain spots on the emulsion like a rash, a skin disease, but not other rolls. Beyond recording events, such as the visit of King Abdullah of Jordan to Jerusalem in 1948-1949, Glob Pasha's visit to the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem in 1948, or the summer camps of Armenian youth in Deir Ammar and other family occasions, and the thousands of locations recorded on these negatives. The gelatin and nitrate bases of these rolls, their structural bodies themselves, testify to the instability of their historical historical context, and have indirectly recorded their displacement. So what I'm saying here, just to sum it up in 2 words, these images do not record any of the political atmosphere that was going on in Palestine back then. They are banal pictures. But what happened to them, what had happened to the negatives, the patches that you see there, are indirectly a result of the photographer's displacement due to political divisions. Or else, because could it be the poor washing at the makeshift darkroom? Could it be the poor washing at a makeshift darkroom that Bakirjian might have set up at the Armenian convent after he was deprived of his own darkroom? How ironical and poetic at the same time that he was taking these pictures at the exact, or he was developing them and washing them in the exact place of birth of local photography in the entire Middle East. Could it be the wash that Fuad al-Khoury gave to these rolls in 1998, 50 years after they were exposed, that caused the emulsion to deteriorate and crack? Could it be reasons related to poor conservation, or is it that the nitrate film base of some of the rolls reacted badly to changes in climate between Jerusalem and Beirut? The great thing about archives is that confirmation of what has happened or what has triggered these phenomena can rarely be reached, and any attempt to find a reason would be total speculation. Yet there is so much poetry in how these images contribute to history, detaching themselves slowly from the basis to which they have been bound for almost 70 years now. It's precisely their disintegration, not their depiction of event, where their contribution to history lies. So it's their disintegration. With their disintegration, they write history. It's not with the depiction of event that they write history. Cold storage is a space designed to preserve photographic collections and prevent any such deterioration from happening. It ensures a neutral environment with stable temperature and humidity levels. It is an essential space for institutions holding photographic collections because it helps secure longer life for photographs. Besides protecting them from physical manipulation by taking them away of circulation, cold storage ensures that any chemical residues of development and fixing processes do not continue to act on the photographic matter and hence cause further deterioration of the gelatin or paper on which the image is recorded. It also ensures that any unexposed silver that might have not been washed out by fixing would not continue to change or oxidize, therefore affecting the appearance of the recorded image. Those who have worked in a darkroom know how magical developing images can be. No matter how scientific the explanation is, contemplating an object while it's changing in front of your eyes from white turning into an image can be mesmerizing. But we also know that some processes cannot be completely stopped in controlled climate. They will be slowed down but still continue to take place. In 1948 also, Palestinian photographer Khalil Raad left Talbiye, where he lived with his family near Jerusalem, and went back to Lebanon, where he was born. He comes from the Lebanese family Raad, near Hamdoun. His father died in the 1860 massacres against Maronites. His mother took him and his sister to live in Palestine, and he became a very well-known Jerusalem photographer. He studied with Garabet Krikorian and became later his competitor. Garabet Krikorian went to study theology to become a priest in the Armenian convent St. James. And then when he learned the photographic tools, he decided to leave the church and become a photographer. And this is how Khalil Raad learned photography. But after learning photography from Garabet Krikorian, he decided to open a shop right across the street from him. So the war exploded both, actually. Both did not see their studios after 1948. Well, Garabet Krikorian had died already, but his son Johannes took care of his shop. And Johannes ended up marrying the niece of Khalil Raad. So then they made it up, so they became friends again. His studio, the studio of Khalil Raad on Jaffa Road in Jerusalem, was located in an area that became a no man's land in 1948. In the years that followed, he tried his best to return and evacuate his collection, but he was not allowed to. He learned later that his shop, where his carefully annotated albums were kept, had already been looted. But a significant number of his negatives were recovered when an Italian friend of his was able to make a hole in the rear wall of the darkroom space and rescue an important part of the collection. But he had died. When this happened, he was dead already. Curator Rona Sela, an Israeli curator who worked a lot on Khalil Raad, explains. Raad's shop located. Why is it so? Because looting is very much tied to the history of photography. It's not like it's like looting archaeology and trafficking archaeology, but photography is like an easy target for looting at times of war. I heard like a few days ago it was published that what's his name, Shafi al-Hud's passport was confiscated by the Israeli army in 1982 just because it had Hebrew in it. It's certain documents are target to looting. So Rona Sela explains, Raad's shop, located on Jaffa Road in Jerusalem near the Jaffa Gate, was destroyed in the fighting of 1948. The shop's contents were looted by Jewish Israeli soldiers and citizens. Albums containing the best of Raad's archive, small prints, were looted as well by an Israeli military commander and are currently held in a private collection. These albums were shown in Israel in the year 2000 and in the year 2010. She produced a book that is that thick about Khalil Raad in Hebrew. Raad's negatives, the archive of negatives, was stored in a different location, in his dark room, located in another building on Jaffa Road, and consequently was saved, survived the looting. The dark room was in an area that became a no man's land in the war. Raad's daughter, Ruth Raad, and her husband, Robert, succeeded in rescuing the negative archive from the dark room. Fuad Debas and Badr al-Hajj claim, based on interviews with Ruth Raad, that the negatives were saved thanks to the help and resourcefulness of an Italian friend of Raad's who worked at Boulos Said bookstore, located in the old city near the Jaffa Gate, very close to the Raad's studio. Despite the difficulties, he managed to enter the area during the ceasefire and transferred the negatives to Ruth, who was living in Amman at the time. The archive, containing around 3,000 negatives, was donated to the Institute of Palestine Studies in Beirut. What I'm interested in here is that everything that belongs to Raad, any work that was made by Khalil Raad, has been looted, except those 3,000 that were officially donated by his family to Beirut. Raad opened his studio in 1889 opposite the studio of his colleague and teacher Garabet Krikorian. They both catered to Jerusalem local community and an influx of tourists and pilgrims visiting the city, and were both known for taking portraits of these visitors in traditional Jerusalem or Bedouin outfit. Both of them offered traditional clothes, swords, and other accessories that tourists could choose to wear for their portrait. In 1998, again, Ito Barada convinced a French artist and curator of Palestinian costumes who lived in Jerusalem, Emmanuel Kleidman, to deposit with the Arab Image Foundation a collection of negatives that included glass plates attributed to Khalil Raad. The plates represented portraits of groups in the studio, but also some portraits of groups posing at the steps leading to the Dome of the Rock, which could be seen in the background. It looked as if Raad himself, or maybe photographers working on his behalf, stood there from time to time to take pictures of visitors to the dome in a probably similar way to many photographers who stationed themselves near the Sphinx in Giza, taking posed pictures of tourists from a certain angle with the pyramids in the background. Kleidman's collection also included other negatives that were attributed to another photographer from Palestine, a Zionist photographer and filmmaker known as Yaakov Bendov. Born 1882, died 1968. So he's much younger than Raad, but they overlapped. Whose parents immigrated to Palestine in 1907. Bendov photographed Jewish European immigrants there in the 1920s and 1930s. And his photographs were made for and used by Zionist propaganda. He photographed young European immigrants settling in Palestine, working the land and making their homes in what had always looked like a deserted land. Bendov's photographs radiate with hope in a new world and depict youth, virgin land, modern machinery, and show prefabricated European-looking homes. It was no surprise to see Bendov and Raad, both of their negatives, in the same collection. After all, the two photographers shared the same city from 1907 to 1948. So imagine random two people in Beirut living for 40 years, practicing the same, like two architects, for example. It's inevitable not to know each other, no? But their photographs described different worlds. Kleidman's collection is probably the only repository space of these two photographers' glass plates, the only space that these glass plates shared. And it is not entirely clear how Raad's negatives came to be in Kleidman's hands. Although Ito Barada's notes mention that he found the plates in the shop of an old Greek photographer who was going blind. As for, like scribbles, as for Bendov's collection, Kleideman mentioned to Barada that a student had found them in an apartment that had just been cleared and gave them to him. So someone took all the furniture in that home and just left the pictures, the glass plates. The collection was actually, some of them were also negatives. They were, I think, gelatin, not only glass plates. As for Bendov's, Kleideman mentioned to Barada that a student, the collection was deposited at the Arab Image Foundation from 1998 to 2004 with storming, like really difficult discussions about whether the Arab Image Foundation should keep these pictures or not, for many reasons related to regulations, the fact that Kleideman might have carried an Israeli passport, we don't know, or whether or not we have the right to keep Zionist propaganda as well. But discussions always ended up wishing to keep the collection. The collection was deposited until 2004 when Kleideman requested finally it to be returned. Contact prints that Agop Kalechian made of this collection in Beirut on glossy RC paper is the only trace that remains of this collection in the Arab Image Foundation's library today. Despite a deep schism in the history of one place between Arab and Zionist, these photographs still share one thing: that's a collector's attempt to undivide. A conservator's nightmare is to lose a collection he or she preserves. When you live in an unstable political system like here, like in Syria, like in Egypt, when you have experienced war not so long ago and are still surrounded by it, the fear is justified. When looting museums and archaeological sites has become a common practice in situations of chaos such as in Iraq, Egypt, or Syria, you wonder what would remain if significant records of human activity vanished. Would empty cases testify to the missing pieces formerly displayed in them? Would the memory of, these are from the exhibition. These are glass plates that I remade from the contact prints that were made by the Arab Image Foundation that figure now in our library. I took them and took the images from them and printed them on glass, and the glass plates are displayed like this, every two together. So it's always a glass plate of Bendov and a glass plate of Khalil Rad. And I produced from them cyanotypes. And I claim that the cyanotypes would print every time an image of Bendov with in it like a watermark coming from an image of Khalil Rad. And this is what I'm talking about, the undividing history of one place. And as if trying to say that you cannot talk about the history of Zionism without mentioning the Palestinians, and you cannot talk about Palestine anymore as if the Zionists don't exist, as if Israel doesn't exist. And I think it's not legitimate to divide history, because history is above division. So would the memory of empty cases allow us to recreate what was formerly in them? And if they did, would it silence our ease as conservators, or our anxiety or fear of losing them? This is from Malawi, following the storming of Rabaa by the Egyptian army. This is a museum, the Museum of Malawi, after the riots in response. Description is a representation or an account of an event an object or a person, indirectly it seeks to seize a certain totality or a part of an event, an object or a person. It aims to seize its color, texture, and possibly 3D configuration in an attempt to facilitate its study or diffusion, but also in anticipation of its vanishing. In archaeology, it has become common to make 3D recordings of objects and spatial configurations, fearing their possible destruction, and to replicate and do replicas of entire spaces, such as the ancient tombs at the Valley of Kings, to which tourists are nowadays guided, which while permanently closing the original tombs to the public to ensure their preservation. However, description is also about a set of other less visible traits, perhaps more significant traits, and ties to other practices and to a living fabric. To describe these as well is to engage with or borrow tools from history, from anthropology and other disciplines, which aren't only technical or descriptive, but rather analytical. To reproduce an object requires know-how, but to understand what the object represents, its function, or how it came to be, what role it plays in this whole ecosystem, requires a different kind of knowledge that is not only technical. Description in creative fields such as writing, art, and architecture involves utilizing all of those means to create an informed object. Maybe that type of description should be called informed description. An informed object is an object that is conscious of the material and of the processes that produced it, conscious of its provenance, its morphology, and displacement over time, conscious of its history in the sense that it's able to communicate it. An informed object is already mobilized and activated. It cannot be a silent object. An informed object has elaborated a language of its own. Informed objects are objects which might be missing a part only to accentuate other part or highlight other parts. They might miss features or look broken up to show inner parts. An informed object is not a realistic object, but is somehow schematic. It functions like an exploded view of a machine, which is an unrealistic representation informed about the inside of a machine, its construction and its assembly, and is therefore able to explain it to the users of this machine. It functions like a model of a human body used in an anatomy class. A photograph changes upon the vanishing of its referent. The death of a living person represents a threshold in the life of their portrait. Nahla Haydou's picture would not have hung in public had she not been killed in the Kana massacre. When the body vanishes, each of its descriptions is recalled to fulfill a new function. A picture hangs, an anecdote is told, a gesture is reenacted in memory of those who are no longer there. There are so many ways to reenact significant traits of a description. Each trait would privilege a story over others, as if withdrawing the others from description. How about completely withdrawing the portrait of Haydous from the reproduction of the framed portrait? What would the frame tell? And what about withdrawing the framed object completely? What would the shadow tell about the object? And if withdrawal continues successively, what would remain a 4x5 Kodak Ektachrome sheet of an EPP stock, 2252, discontinued in 2009? Or is it simply the number 113SH? And what if even this Ektachrome sheet were no longer there? Would the memory of a lightbox surface have anything to tell? do acid-free boxes in cold storage, remember. And if there is an after image to every image, is it recordable? Is it retrievable? An after image is by definition a visual impression of a vivid sensation retained after stimulus has ceased. An after image cannot be induced, it just takes place. Is it possible to preserve an after image? An after image is photography, after all.